Alrighty. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to Laura for joining us. And thank you to everybody who is joining us in the recording as well. So what we will do is I'm going to hand over to Laura. We have some designated time for questions towards the end. If you have any questions and you'd like to put them into the chat during the talk, that's perfectly fine. I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And then we'll have, depending on how we go with time, I'll reserve some time at the end to turn the recording off. So if you'd like to ask a question that isn't part of the recording, you're absolutely welcome to. So yes, welcome, Laura. Thank you so much for being here. And I will hand it directly over to you.
Lovely, thank you. So hello, everyone from University of Glasgow's Neurodiversity Network and anyone else who is watching along today. My name is Laura Kate Dale and I'm today's speaker. Before I dive right into today's talk, which is going to be focusing on the intersection between trans and autistic status, a little bit of background about myself and my relationship to this topic. As I said, my name's Laura. I'm an autistic trans woman. I was diagnosed as autistic in my teens. I came out as trans at a similar time in my life. I also have ADHD and a couple of other disabilities, but they are not going to be central to my discussions today. I'm an author. I've written books about life at the intersection of being autistic and trans, such as 2019's Uncomfortable Labels, as well as separately writing and editing two anthologies, one called Gender Euphoria, which was focused on real life stories of trans people's joy, and another that is currently in the process of being written about autistic people's stories of experiences of joy. I've also been involved in activism work around both of those aspects of my identity. I've been invited along today to talk about my experiences as a trans person, my experiences as an autistic person, and how those two identities intersect for me personally. I'll be giving some basic background information about what it can mean to be trans or to be autistic, some struggles that can come at that intersection, but also some of the joys that each identity can involve. Additionally, I'm going to be talking about some of the context around discussions of autistic trans existence and why some of these conversations only really started surfacing in a mainstream fashion in fairly recent years, as well as some of the things that are important for those outside to understand about the autistic trans experience. After that, as mentioned, we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end, so if you have any specific questions, make a note of them for the end of the talk. Don't be afraid to ask anything specific you might be wondering. I will try and be as open as possible today. Before I get properly into this, I want to be very clear that my talk today is very much about my own personal experiences as an autistic trans woman. I cannot speak authoritatively on behalf of every trans, autistic, or intersectionally trans and autistic person. While I'm going to try and provide some general background information and some information that is helpful as a sort of general rule of thumb, my experience will differ from those of other individuals, particularly of other intersectional identities. I cannot be a stand-in for all autistic trans people's perspectives. So, with that out of the way, let's dive in. We're going to start today with a bit of an overview of the basics of what it can mean to be trans and to be autistic in isolation as separate topics. Some of this is perhaps going to be reiterating basics that some of you will already know very well, particularly if you are one of those identities, but it feels useful to get some of the basics out of the way in order to make sure that we have sort of a solid ground going in. I'm going to try and keep this section brief, but I also want to make sure not to try not to avoid any of the important foundational knowledge that's important to discussing intersectionality. There will be undoubtedly things I oversimplify or gloss over for the sake of time, but I will try and to go into appropriate levels of depth regardless. So, starting with autism. Autism is often referred to as a spectrum condition because it impacts a wide range of aspects of how the brain works and impacts people with the condition differently from person to person. As a general rule of thumb, autistic people struggle with a combination of interpersonal communication with non-autistic people, typically less so with other autistic people. We can struggle with the reading of non-verbal cues and subtext, can get overwhelmed by intense sensory information, and can have difficulty with changes in plans and routine, finding repetition and predictability mentally calming. When we talk about autism being a spectrum condition, we're not describing a straight line from more autistic to less autistic. You may have heard terms used like high functioning or low functioning, which the autistic community generally is pushing back against and moving away from, as the terms tend to generally suggest this very straightforward more or less autistic line. The way I tell people to try and think about autism is to think of it like a spider chart, lots of independent variables that can be higher or lower separately from each other. I might have, for example, high difficulty in sensory processing, low difficulty in social interaction, high difficulty with changes in routine and structure. These are all things that could be difficulties to varying degrees that don't fit neatly onto a single more or less autistic line. People who are autistic generally have areas they find difficult, some that they find more manageable, and most attempts to paint autistic people as being autistic on this sort of standard graded line end up translating into how well can this autistic person avoid being an inconvenience to me? That's generally what it ends up becoming. However, all of that description is very clinical, very diagnostic, and pretty negatively framed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself here and some of the positive aspects of being autistic that I would attribute to myself. While I personally struggle with many of the things that I've mentioned in this talk, many of those aspects of being autistic, I also enjoy a lot of the parts of my personality that are undoubtedly a result of my being an autistic person. And I know I'd be a fundamentally different person if I wasn't autistic. Many of us on the autism spectrum have special areas of interest, things that we have a deep-seated love and obsession with, which could range from obsessively reading technical manuals about how engines work to obsessively watching the same children's film on loop for years. These obsessive interests can come and go with time, but at least for me, they're a secure point of joy I can return to in the world. Talking about myself as an example, I have a special interest in trains. It's a bit of an autism stereotype, but it exists for a reason. I'm not obsessed with how they mechanically work, but with their societal function. They're a mode of transport that follows these precise rules, arrives exactly when it's meant to, and there's something really beautiful societally about that as a function. They rock gently and produce a really nice background sound, and I enjoy them as a thing that exists in the world. This special interest isn't useful to me in day-to-day life. Not every autistic person has a special interest that is some kind of savant level ability or that they can put to some kind of amazing use, like you may have seen in some media portrayals. But it's a thing that I know that if I'm having a stressful day and I'm struggling with changes in routine and those sort of things, and I need help emotionally regulating, I know that I can go watch a video of a train going for a drive through a town that I've never seen and use that to help myself emotionally regulate. That is something that is a direct response to me being autistic. For me, there's also experiences of the things like the joy of being able to enjoy a thing I love on repeat and never enjoy it any less through repetition. If I have a favorite song, I can put it on loop for days and days and days and not stop enjoying it. I find comfort in familiarity, which means that things I love can get better through immersive repetition. The less surprising a thing is from repetition, the more I can grow to rely on it as a constant, which brings a unique joy of its own. Before we move on from this, I want to talk about some common misconceptions about autism and some important sort of facts to know and some descriptions that I want to provide for anyone who happens to not be autistic to get a more understandable view of some aspects from the outside. And again, I reiterate, I'm largely talking through my own lens. There may be people who have different experiences. So you may have heard the term Asperger's syndrome used in the past, which is a diagnostic term that used to exist, but is generally being phased out. It is the diagnosis I received a decade or more ago when I was diagnosed. I don't use it for myself anymore. It was typically used to mean autistic person who is verbal, but we have decided probably won't need too much help living day-to-day life from whatever limited experience the doctor has. It's very much being phased out as a term and replaced with just the umbrella diagnosis autism spectrum disorder, because A, it's not a separate condition, it's autism. It's, if you look at that spider graph metaphor that I discussed before, largely where you were on the verbal slider decided which of the diagnostic terms you were probably going to be given. Secondly, it was a diagnostic term that was cooked up by a literal Nazi who it's named after, who basically used it to sort autistic people into useful autistic people and ones I have no use for. You may come across autistic people who still use the term for themselves who were diagnosed with it. That is a personal thing. But what I want to sort of reiterate to anyone who doesn't know the term well or is not aware of this is, if someone tells you they are autistic, your response should never be to say, well, you seem very normal. Is it Asperger's? Do you just have Asperger's? Asperger's as a term, it has often been colloquially used as, do you have autism light? And that is sort of a big part of why it's being phased out. And it's something that I still see come up a lot from people who are not autistic, and even sometimes within the community, not an awareness of some of how that term is used, which is why I sort of wanted to discuss it there. Some common misconceptions about the autistic community include the view that autistic people like myself don't feel emotions or feel empathy towards others. This is very much not the case. We may just not display it the same way as other people. Much like any community, some people won't feel particularly empathetic. Within the autistic community, a lot of times experiences of hyper empathy and difficulty regulating emotion, even when dealing with the emotions of others, can come up. We may struggle to relate to situations we lack a frame of reference for, but that is the exception more than the rule. Autistic people, myself included, often show empathy to others by sharing stories from our own lives where we felt a similar way, as a method of showing that we understand the emotions the other person is or was experiencing, and that we understand what emotions are going on in a story being told. This is unfortunately often seen by neurotypical people as us trying to make the conversation about ourselves. It's called relational empathy, and it is a very commonly observed thing with autistic people. We're not trying to take over the conversation. We're trying to show that we understand how you're feeling and that we're actively listening to and understanding your story. In terms of best ways to support autistic people in your life, it can be helpful to understand a few key areas of struggle and behaviors, particularly for people who are not autistic. I spoke earlier in this talk about sensory oversensitivity, but I didn't really go into specifics on what it is or what it can be like to experience as an autistic person. For most non-autistic people, in a room with multiple audio sources, for example, your brain has a reasonable degree of skill at tuning out background noise and focusing on a specific sound source you're trying to focus on. The same goes for other types of sensory input. A non-autistic person's brain can generally filter out a lot of unnecessary information on the fly without having to really think about it. For many autistic people, what is missing is this ability to filter sensory information by priority. All sensory information is happening at the same level of priority, which can get really overwhelming. Using sound as an example, it's often less about the volume of noise, but the complexity, the amount of layers of sound happening at once. Sounds which may filter out for someone who isn't autistic, such as the hum of lightning or an electrical socket or someone's PC fan, may be constants for an autistic person. I also want to talk about the misconception that autistic people are a risk to others when overwhelmed, which is something that I've seen come up from people who don't understand what is going on when an autistic person can get overwhelmed. When an autistic person becomes overwhelmed, often by a combination of things like changes to plan and routine alongside overwhelming sensory information, we may experience an autistic shutdown or meltdown. A shutdown may look like the person mentally detaching from the world, just retreating inside themselves, becoming numb, trying to disconnect from sensory input they are overwhelmed by. Meltdown might look like the autistic person becoming agitated, anxious, physically restless, potentially doing repeated movements such as rocking back and forth, flapping or rotating hands, or in some cases, and I know that this is one that is somewhat common and sometimes distressing if it's not understood by people on the outside, things like hitting the side of the head with the flat of the palm. While this can be distressing to see from the outside if you don't understand what's going on, I want to make clear that in most cases, an autistic person who is experiencing a meltdown is not posing a threat to you and is engaging in something called stimming, which I will explain in a second, to try and regulate their emotional state. Stimming stands for self-stimulatory behavior and is an umbrella term that covers any type of repetitive, predictable movement or sensory input engaged in by an autistic person. This covers things like the previously mentioned rocking back and forth, could be rhythmic humming, foot tapping, hand flapping, spinning. The purpose of this is to introduce predictable sensory information to focus on, centering the autistic person and grounding them in the aftermath of unexpected routine changes or unpredictable sensory information. Basically, when an autistic person like myself has been overwhelmed by a world full of unpredictable chaos, focusing on a single physical or sensory sensation that is predictable at regular intervals can be a way of cutting through overwhelming clutter mentally. In a general sense, some very quick things that I would suggest if for anyone who is watching who is not autistic, who would benefit from some basic advice on how to help autistic people in their lives. Be aware that the sensory information that causes someone problems may not be immediately obvious to you. If someone comes to you and asks you if you can make a small accommodation for them sensory-wise, don't assume it's being overplayed because whatever the sensory information is isn't particularly noticeable to you. Your brain may just be better at tuning it out. Recognize that not everyone shares the same communication method, needs and preferences as you, and make efforts to accommodate those where you can. An autistic person may prefer text-based communication to spoken discussions, or may prefer, if you're going to message them that you need to chat about something, that you let them know the conversation topic in advance so that they know what's coming and don't get stuck paranoid about it. And lastly, be careful to avoid infantilization, treating autistic people like we're incapable of self-understanding and agency. I'm sure that any of you coming to an event like this know that that is a bad thing to do, but it is a major issue very frequently faced by the autistic community, and one that I'm definitely going to be coming back to later in this talk when we, in a little bit, get to talking about the autistic trans intersection specifically. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the other isolated side of this discussion, the trans umbrella and some of the things that being trans can encompass. When we talk about someone being a trans person, there's a couple of different ways that term is used today, both as a specific term for binary gender transition and as an umbrella term to refer to a variety of other identities where a person involved doesn't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. While people typically use sex and gender as terms interchangeably, because for most people these two do line up, when talking with or about trans and non-binary people, you may find these used as two separate concepts. A person's sex is typically used to refer to physical aspects of a person relating to their body. Does their body produce testosterone or estrogen? Do they have a vagina or a penis? Typically, this is recorded at birth. It's based on physical observations. A doctor will look at a child and register their sex based on those observations on a birth certificate. Depending on your country, sex is not an unchangeable fact on legal paperwork. Where I live in England, a trans person who has been granted a gender recognition certificate by the government can get a new birth certificate where their sex is listed to match their gender rather than the observations made at birth. Gender, if we're talking about it as an individual term, is often used to refer to a person's inherent sense of self. When someone talks about their gender identity, they might, for example, mean that while they have physical characteristics that someone might describe as male, they might have a beard or a penis, They may feel deeply that they are, for example, female, despite these physical factors. That might be their gender. Using myself as an example, when I was born, doctors recorded my sex on my birth certificate as male because I had a penis and no conflicting physical characteristics. I identify as a woman, I am a trans woman, and after many years living as a woman, I was able to get a gender recognition certificate. My gender has always been female, but it took years for me to convince the government to update my sex to female. Also, to clear up a misconception I see very frequently, sex recorded on birth certificates is in no way, shape, or form based on chromosomes. Most people, myself included, probably all of you who are here watching this talk today, will go your whole lives without ever having your chromosomes tested in any way. You may have assumptions about them, but you have probably never had them checked. There are conditions that we will address shortly where a person's physical appearance and chromosomes may not line up as expected. Chromosomes do not have any direct bearing on sex recorded on birth certificates. So I'm going to go through a few more sort of terms, and then we're going to get into the meat of this discussion. So I know some of this is going to be well-known ground already, but I want to get these sort of terms out of the way before I go into too much depth on them. Gender assigned at birth is exactly what it sounds like. At birth, a doctor will observe a child's body, decide what sex to register on a birth certificate, and to make the assumption that their gender matches, because in most cases that is the case. You may see people use terms like AMAB or AFAB, assigned male or assigned female at birth, to describe themselves, but these are phrases that are falling out of favor and terms that if you're not trans, I would advise against ascribing to other people on their behalf or asking them to use for themselves. Intersex is an umbrella term that's used to discuss people whose sex doesn't fit neatly into male or female. Around 1% of people worldwide fit under this umbrella, which can cover anything from a person having a chromosomal difference that never physically manifests, to a person having physical development that is a mix of what might be expected from male or female development. Intersex children are usually registered as male or female on birth certificates, and in many cases will have surgery performed as infants to make them more neatly fit into a binary gendered box. Intersex people are fighting to stop these surgeries, as they are performed before the person is old enough to consent to the choice of how their body will be altered. While this talk isn't directly about the experiences of intersex people, I feel like it's important to note that some intersex people do identify as transgender, often if their gender identity doesn't align with surgical choices made by doctors when they were young. The existence of intersex people shouldn't be used to win arguments about trans people's validity, but intersex trans people exist, and that is a thing. In discussions of trans experiences, binary is a term that's used to talk about people who identify as a gender that neatly fits into either the box of male or female. For example, someone like myself, I was assigned male at birth. I am a trans woman. I identify as a woman. I fit neatly into one of those binary gendered boxes. People who are not trans, cisgender people, are generally also binary in that they were assigned a gender and they're happy to stick in that box. Non-binary is an umbrella term for identities that don't fit neatly into either of those binary boxes. A non-binary person may feel like their gender sits somewhere between male and female. They might lean a little either side of center, but not feel comfortable fully on either side. They may feel they sit directly at a center or entirely outside of the binary line. Any experience that is not neatly placed in those binaries, that's what the term is for. Non-binary doesn't necessarily mean androgynous. You may find non-binary people who lean towards a binary gender somewhat, and that doesn't invalidate their experiences. Speaking about gender, trans status versus gender nonconformity, in our current society, there's a lot of actions, behaviors, and activities, styles of clothing that are typically considered to be gendered in some way. Parents buy trucks for boys and dolls for girls, skirts for girls and bow ties for boys. A girl may really like playing with trucks, and a boy may be really into ballet. That doesn't mean they're trans. They may simply be gender nonconforming. There is a difference between a person's inherent internal sense of their gender and the way they engage with things that are seen as gendered in the world. A person could be perfectly comfortable being a woman, but really enjoy doing activities that society says are masculine, like repairing classic car engines. Gender is a spectrum, and the gendering of many things is a social construct. So no, just because your kid picks up and plays with a toy that's not designed with their gender in mind, doesn't mean they're necessarily trans. Doctors aren't going to push them to transition. To feel inherently like your gender differs is a separate and distinct experience. To talk a little bit about myself and to sort of try and give an example there, putting aside any aspects of the way I present to the world, any gendered activities I might enjoy or not enjoy, I primarily came out as trans because during puberty, I felt incredibly uncomfortable with the physical changes happening to my body. For me specifically, my voice started to get lower because of testosterone. I started to grow facial hair. My voice didn't feel like my voice anymore. My face didn't look like my face. I felt ill at ease with the gendered aspects of my body that were changing. I felt unlike myself. That is very different from trying to suggest that, you know, had I as someone that was assigned male at birth wanted to play with a doll, that would have automatically meant I was trans. It's those are two separate things that can coexist or not. Last couple of summaries. We're nearly through this bit. Some people live with a feeling of not having a gender at all. It's not that they feel somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. They might feel entirely off to one side away from the whole discussion. That the term for that is someone being agender. Some people's experience of gender shifts over time. Someone might feel male at one point in time, feel female at a different time. Gender identity isn't always a fixed, immutable thing. Last few terms. Social transition is living as a new gender in social roles outside of the medical system. Using myself as an example, I started my transition by socially transitioning. I asked my friends and family to call me Laura and to use she, her pronouns for me. I started to dress differently. I started to identify myself as female when asked by others. I hadn't taken any medications or had any surgery. I was living socially as a woman. I had socially transitioned. Medical transition is all the parts of transition that a doctor might be involved in, which require waiting lists and assessments. As an adult, a trans person might go to a doctor and get medication that puts their current puberty on hold, may get medication to start a new, different puberty, may eventually get surgery to alter aspects of their body. Medical transition isn't a requirement for a trans person to be valid as a trans person, and it's important that we not gatekeep trans rights behind requirements to undergo medical intervention. Gender dysphoria, as a term, that's the name for the feeling of distress and disconnect experienced by many trans people like myself when forced to experience their gender that was assigned at birth. From being referred to by the wrong pronouns, to feeling excluded from gendered activities or friendships, to feeling upset about changes to appearance that have traditionally gendered connotations. It's basically a looming feeling of wrongness around gender. Gender euphoria, the inverse of gender dysphoria, is a positive, affirming feeling that comes as a result of having your gender identity recognized by others. So with all of the definitions out of the way, a couple of like little misconceptions and questions to go through, and then I'm going to jump into how these two things combine. Are gender identity and sexuality connected? No, not at all. A trans woman can be gay, straight, bisexual, or any other sexuality, just like a cis woman. Gender is who you feel you are, and sexuality is who you're attracted to. You could be attracted to men and feel like a woman, or be attracted to men and feel like a man. The two aren't inherently interlinked. In terms of ways you can practically support trans people in your lives right now, the most important context to understand is that over the last 6 or so years specifically, there's been a very sharp uptick in anti-trans rhetoric gaining mainstream platforming by media outlets and politicians, which has led to a huge rise in transphobic hate crimes, as well as the material rolling back of a number of basic rights for trans people. Trans people are facing increased barriers gatekeeping them from healthcare and legal recognition, while enduring an onslaught of negative stories, fear-mongering, using us as a new media scapegoat. We're facing increasing delays to accessing healthcare, often leading to worse healthcare outcomes, while trying to live up to impossible appearance standards and being used as political talking points rather than treated as people. The fundamental thing the trans community, particularly the autistic trans community, needs right now is simple vocal acceptance and support, particularly debunking of anti-trans talking points. So, I realize we're quite a way into this talk, but let's get to the meat of this, talking about the autistic trans intersection. Being both trans and autistic is a far more common overlap of experiences than many of you are probably aware. The numbers differ a little from study to study, but the general consensus is that an autistic person is around 8 to 10 times more likely to be trans than rates seen in the general population, and vice versa. While it's far from a one-to-one correlation, the overlap occurs frequently enough to be significant and is important to understand. So why do more people not talk about this fact? Well, there's a couple of main reasons, some coming from within the autistic trans community and some from outside forces. The trans community has been aware for a very long time now that a lot of trans people are also autistic. The autistic trans community for a long time had no evidence to back this up beyond anecdotes, because it hadn't really been studied formally, but it was a fairly common bit of information in certain circles. If you get diagnosed autistic and get diagnosed with gender dysphoria, your doctor's not going to tell you that overlap is common and that, there might be things that intersect and are worth understanding. Even to this day, it's still something that autistic trans people sort of have to discover for ourselves. One of the big reasons the autistic trans community didn't bring this information forward more publicly when it was sort of anecdotally being shared was, put simply, fear of how the information might be weaponized, both against the autistic trans community, but also against the wider trans community outside of autistic trans people, as an excuse to gatekeep transition. As I mentioned a little earlier in this talk, autistic people are often infantilized, treated as though we are incapable of self-understanding, self-agency, or being able to make our own choices free from being manipulated. This is a common issue for the autistic community generally, and one that, if paired with a trans healthcare system that already looks for any excuse to deny or delay transition healthcare, that could spell disaster. When I transitioned in the UK over a decade ago, this was already becoming known in small sections of medical circles, and was definitely already being weaponized to deny autistic trans people the right to transition. I experienced this personally firsthand, having to go through extensive additional layers of gatekeeping and additional delays to prove I was capable of making this choice about my own body. I was not trusted to be capable of making my own choices and having agency about my body because I was autistic. I also experienced this infantilization outside of medical settings from people who didn't know about that overlap, such as my mother when I came out. My mother was paranoid that because I was autistic, my therapist must have talked me into transition against my will, and that as an autistic person, I couldn't be trusted not to have been brainwashed. Lastly, the autistic trans community feared this information getting into the hands of anti-trans hate groups. This fear was ultimately proven true, as in the last couple of years, this has become more well-known within anti-trans circles, and has very quickly become one of the favored talking points of anti-trans hate groups, as well as high-profile figures, including J.K. Rowling, who insists that no person should be allowed to transition, no person at all, because of the trans autistic correlation to, as she put it, help protect helpless autistic people not getting forced into transition against their will. It's weaponizing infantilization of autistic people as having no agency and not being able to speak for and advocate for ourselves, and using that as a weapon to say that no one should be allowed to transition. As a result of all of these factors, it wasn't until perhaps 4 or 5 years ago that this conversation really came more to the forefront. We started to see certain academic circles catch wind of these discussions that had been sort of quietly circulating for many years. And the earliest academic studies theorizing on reasons why this overlap exists started to come to the forefront. Usually these studies' findings are boiled down to the idea that autistic people are less likely to follow societal norms and therefore less afraid to transition. It's a theory that never really held much weight for me. If you look at a lot of these studies, they're largely done by people who are not autistic and not trans, making outside educated guesses without actually talking to autistic trans people. Regardless of why this overlap exists, though, what we do know is that this overlap exists. Back in 2019, I published my first book, Uncomfortable Labels, about my experiences living as an autistic trans person, at a time where there was very little in the way of first-hand stories focused on life at this intersection. The book largely focused on areas where my transition and my being autistic caused conflict for each other, and the book was generally pretty negative in tone, even if it did end on a positive note. It was a story about the struggles that I had at that intersection, that tried to serve as an explainer for those outside of the intersection what unique challenges existed, so that our unique needs could be better understood. I stand by it being the correct approach for that book to take, focusing on those struggles, despite in the years since focusing more of my work on talking about stories of joy that resulted from my identity, and I'll get to that in a bit. I went undiagnosed as autistic until my late teens, due to a school system that saw me as rule-following, obedient, and non-disruptive, and as a result, didn't see my obvious autistic traits as something that needed outside intervention. I didn't come out as trans until a similar time, as puberty was a big catalyst for me feeling the need to seek support, and I grew up in an era that lacked visible trans people, in reality or fiction, that I could look to as hopeful examples of what transition might mean. As a result, I had a childhood very much built on a lack of self-understanding and a disconnection from my peers. Coming to understand myself better in two pretty major ways in quick succession led to me having a young adulthood very centered on applying this new understanding of myself in practice, and thinking about the ways that I could have been better supported during some very confusing and isolating years. I came out the other side a very positive and optimistic person, but it was a lot to take in at once, how much of my life had been spent struggling with aspects of myself I didn't have a name for. I'm going to quickly talk through some of those intersectional struggles I experienced here, as I think it's important to understand what makes the autistic trans experience potentially unique. But I'm going to talk about joy after this, and why I couldn't really discuss joy until my struggles had been addressed. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but it should be a good starting point for people who are outside and thinking about this intersection. The trans community has very high expectations placed on us that we need to pass, a term which, politely put, means remove all visible cues that we are trans, become invisible, to be considered attractive, to be taken seriously as a real trans person whose identity is valid, or to avoid harassment and accusations we've faked our identity for nefarious purposes. As a trans woman, for me, this manifests as things like having to watch political cartoons get released depicting trans women as ugly, hairy men sneaking into the women's bathroom, full beard, trying to take photos under the stalls while wearing a trans women are women t-shirt. It's this idea that if I can't make myself essentially invisible, looking identical to cis women around me, that I'm probably some evil, nasty predator. Now, there's a lot of factors that may limit a trans person's ability to pass, if that's a thing they even want to at all. It's not a thing I want to at this point in my life. The age that you start hormones, for example, makes a really big difference to your appearance, particularly if a multiple year delay takes place during a person's first puberty because a doctor doesn't want to let you transition because you're autistic. That was my experience. I had to go through about 3 additional unnecessary years of testosterone-based puberty because, you know, my gender clinic doctor was trying to make sure I definitely wasn't being misled because I was autistic. That was 3 years of changes to my body that there's a limit to what I can do about, and that will always be the case for me. As a trans person who is autistic, the situation I faced was that a doctor would tell me they were just making sure I wasn't being coerced. It was just a safeguarding measure because I was autistic. But for me, that was years of changing that I couldn't do anything about. Additionally, for me, a lot of the ways that I could change my appearance to fit in more invisibly as a trans woman are activities that were difficult for me on a sensory level. I struggled with the feeling of makeup on my face, this layer of sensory input of touch sensation on my face at all times was a really difficult thing to mentally tune out. shaving on a daily or possibly multiple times daily basis was a source of sensory oversensitivity that made it difficult for me to do, even when it was important for my own self-image regarding my appearance or for my safety. While arranging a new wardrobe of gendered clothing was a great way of helping myself feel less dysphoric about my body, as an autistic person, I had suddenly a huge number of new fabric types, outfit cuts, straps, sleeve types, new necklines to mentally process. Clothing that for years had been autistic, predictable sensory staples became hard to implement while trying to present myself in a way that would have me seen and perceived the way I wanted to be seen. Moving on from sensory-related topics, as an autistic person, I found things like voice training difficult, the act of learning to move my voice into a more feminine vocal range. This is because I really struggle with paying attention to small changes in inflection in myself and others, which makes learning new ways of manipulating my voice more difficult. Similarly, attempts to learn more feminine non-verbal movements were difficult too, as was learning a whole set of new social cues, which cropped up as the world started to see me and treat me as a woman. The rules for how I needed to behave to navigate social situations changed really quickly, and my years of methodically learned social interaction flowcharts no longer guaranteed me getting through life safely. I suddenly had to relearn things that had taken me years to puzzle out because I was seen differently by the world and all of the unwritten rules changed. Now, these examples are a really small list. I have enough thoughts on this that I wrote an entire book on it, but what these examples are fundamentally trying to get at is a series of ways in which being autistic made it harder for me to be a trans person in the kinds of ways that would make me societally acceptable during a period of increased global transphobia. I couldn't make myself invisible the way the world seemed to want, and so I felt like a failure. A big part of why my story as an autistic trans person started off with my areas of struggle, as is the case for many autistic trans people, is that assimilation means validity and safety, and it's hard to feel valid in your identity at first without that. There are things that we need the world to understand about us, about our intersection, in order to not be perceived as not trying as hard as other trans people, which is important in a world where even trans people who do follow all of the rules that non-trans society has set out for us are still faced with harassment and lost rights. It's important to talk about the struggles of the intersection because it feels important that we see change in the level of understanding afforded to us. But at some point, I had to make a change. After a few years of educating people about the struggles of my identity, hoping for understanding that might improve my community's conditions, I realized I didn't want that to be my relationship to my being trans or autistic. I could tell people about what difficulties I experienced at that intersection, but I also needed people to understand that my life, our lives, are so much more than that. Autistic trans lives can be joyous, and that joy isn't dependent on whether people are able to understand what we're going through. Joy is universal, even if our sources of joy may differ. There are caveats that I end up having to make before I talk about my joy as an autistic trans person, or I end up getting shut down before I even started. I get accusations that I'm saying that being autistic is always wonderful and never a challenge. I'm certainly not saying that. I get people who will accuse me of saying that coming out as trans will never come with societal hardships or personal costs, which of course I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that stories of joy, mine as well as those of other autistic trans people, need to be allowed to exist as part of our stories, as much a part of our stories as the moments where the world is clashing with us. Trans autistic joy might look like my wedding day. I got to get married on a moving train as an autistic person with a special interest in trains. I won a competition, the whole wedding day paid for as a prize, including a beautiful fancy wedding dress, the most gender euphoric day of my life, being the beautiful regal center of attention next to my wonderful autistic wife in a train carriage with specially monogrammed headrests we got to take home with us. Autistic trans joy could look like the first time that me and my wife went swimming together after the pandemic, enjoying the shared sensory experience of all the sounds of the world just going quiet under the water, floating in sensory consistency, having come past the anxiety of using a gender-changing area, and everything just being okay, and us getting to swim together in cute feminine outfits. Autistic joy might be sitting on the floor obsessively organizing trading cards. Trans joy might be using those same methods of sorting and organizing and prioritizing when it came time to decide on a new name for myself. A moment of trans joy might be the first time I felt my breasts bouncing running down the stairs, knowing that estrogen was finally causing physical changes for me. Autistic joy might have been having the realization that my body was changing, and that for the first time in my life, a change in routine wasn't scary, but exciting. I recognize a lot of this talk was spent explaining what it can mean to be trans or autistic and the fact that those intersect pretty often. But if I could get you all to take away one thing from today, it would honestly just be that behind the diagnostic criteria, the definitions, the explorations of the how and why, as an autistic trans person, I'm just happy to live my life with the struggles and the joys that my intersectional identity rests at. So there you go. I've got some time available for Q&A now. I recognize I've just talked very quickly for 45 minutes. If you've got any questions, I'm sure there will be a message about how you can make that known.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'll give people a minute to pop questions in the chat, and I will take the I'm going to put myself at the front of the line, if that's okay, while people have a chance to pop their questions in. I have come across, within the psychological literature, there's often some confusion or inconsistencies in the use of the term gender euphoria, with some literature saying that it's purely the absence of dysphoria versus the actual presence of joy. And I think my immediate reaction to that was, that doesn't seem right at all. I'm curious your perspective on that.
So I've come across this when reading literature as someone that isn't particularly in the psychology text community, but I've come across this. Quite frankly, what it reads like as a trans person is it reads like it was written by people who can't conceptualize the idea that being trans could be a thing you could feel joyful about. And it really reads like it is at odds with, at least to my understanding, the general consensus of the trans community, which is, I talk about this in my book, Gender Euphoria, very, very specifically about the fact that one of the big things that you'll often see is gender dysphoria being required as a requirement for accessing medical care, because generally doctors will go, if you're not feeling dysphoric, if we can't diagnose you with something wrong, why would you want medical intervention? And the counterpoint I say to that is, I know a lot of trans people who their reason for transition was gender euphoria. It was, I made changes to my name, to the pronouns people refer to me with, and that made me feel actively wonderful. I felt better. I didn't just not feel bad. I felt great about those changes. Those things brought me joy. And that is just as valid a reason for someone to progress with transition as any other. And again, I think that I filled an entire book with people talking about gender euphoria, describing their feelings of joy at being trans. I think that any literature that suggests that gender euphoria is purely an absence of dysphoria is doing discredit to the experiences of particularly non-dysphoric trans people.
I'm just moving to the chat. There's lots of love in the chat saying thank you so much for sharing your experiences, particularly for sharing so many personal experiences. It's very moving. I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say that I read Gender Euphoria last summer and I found it very impactful. We have a question from Josephine. I've always been concerned with science that tries to find the reason why a person might be LGBTQ and or autistic, given that any answer could lead to attempts to stop it happening. Given there seems to be some overlap for some of us to be trans and also autistic, is there a potential political concern in trying to find out the why?
Very much so. And I think that talking about this as a political concern is entirely the right way to think about this. The way I would address this is there is also a statistical overlap between people being autistic and LGBT, between autistic people being non-straight. And you don't see that being brought up and weaponized as a reason for typically for people to not be allowed to come out as gay. You do see it with trans people, and I think it's very specifically because the people who are weaponizing it want an excuse to stop people transitioning, and so they point to it, whereas like they don't bring it up for other groups because they don't have a problem with those other groups as much. And I think that like there is definitely a fear of I think a lot of autistic trans people sort of fall into the camp of, I don't need to understand why this overlap exists. We can just accept that it exists and make the world better for people who fit at that intersection. And the worry definitely, I think, is that, like, I think there's a certain consensus of a lot of us don't agree with the current findings of the psychological community from the outside of why that exists, but we're not going to push back and say that doesn't feel right, because we don't want necessarily more studies going into the why, because again, it very easily leads to a road to eugenicsy stuff. And the second that you can point a causal link between the two, it just makes it easier for people who don't want transition to be allowed to go, oh, there's perhaps some genetic link or something, therefore don't let people transition, just assume they're autistic and don't let them do that to themselves. There is a real concern around that sort of weaponization. And I think that it's very similarly tied in with the way that I think a lot of autistic people feel about a lot of research into the why of autism, is that it's a very short jump from we have found a definitive reason for autism to we can get rid of that. And that feels like a worrying concern. And I think that, like, at least for myself, I can say I would far rather have the psychological community go, cool, that overlap exists. What can we be doing to help people at that overlap? What can we be doing to find ways to help people at that overlap to better have their needs met, rather than necessarily having to know this is why it happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Lex has said, thank you for the talk. One thing that Lex finds challenging about their autisticness is a sensitivity to injustice. And I personally call that my outrageous indignation. Is flares so much in me personally. I wonder if this is something that's also part of your story, and if it is, how do you protect your joy?
It is definitely difficult in that as a trans person, and I recognize that there are other intersectionalities with the trans community that have more difficulty than I will with this, but I'll talk for myself. Being a trans person and being able to sort of keep yourself safe in public life requires a lot of biting your tongue and holding your breath about a lot of kinds of injustices that may come from people shouting nasty comments through to things that are potentially more extreme. As someone that was very much growing up that everything like very like justice by the rules kind of person, it was very difficult, my journey of learning to go, I just have to not engage, even though they've definitely done something wrong and I should be telling that they've done something wrong. I was not always great at it, and it is unfortunately something I've had to really practice and learn, just because often that if someone is shouting something nasty and you respond, you really shouldn't have done that, that might escalate, and that's not safe. And it is unfortunate the amount of that a lot of autistic trans people have to learn to push that injustice sense down a bit.
More appreciation from the chat. What I'm going to do now is turn off the recording. So if anybody would like to